This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Today I'm going to do something a little unusual, although I'm spotlighting a woman whose birthday is today, June 20th, which is the day that we're taping this show. On June 20th, I think it was in 1905, an American woman famous for mostly as a playwright, actually, was born, and that was Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman, born in New Orleans in about 1905. And she was the author of several plays which were well known in the not the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s, I guess, in particular. In the mid-30s, she wrote the play, and it was produced on Broadway, called The Children's Hour. And that is still sometimes revived and shown again. Her other, probably most famous play was about a Southern family and was called The Little Foxes. But I remember several others. Some of her plays were made into films, motion picture films. One of those was one during the Second World War. Actually, I think the play came out in 1940, before the United States entered the war. It was called The Watch on the Rhine. And so those were three of her best-known plays, at least. Lillian Hellman, born on June 20th. Another woman that I'm going to talk about, happens to have a birthday on June 21st, which of course is just going to be tomorrow, this week, June 21st, and that is the woman who came from the far west but made her name in the east, especially in New York City. And her name was Mary McCarthy. Mary McCarthy is remembered particularly for her books, Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, which was an autobiographical account. And also she wrote a novel which was for almost 2 years on the bestseller list in the 1960s. It was called The Group. She wrote often about women, and The Group is certainly about women, based on her memories of having been a student, I believe, at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. So the two women came together, interestingly enough, in the 1980s, and that is still resounding today, because just this year, in 2014, there has been a play, I think off-Broadway, played during the spring for at least a month or so, and it was called Hellman versus McCarthy, or maybe it was called McCarthy versus Hellman. But it had to do with a famous difficulty that the two women had starting in the 1980s, when they were, both of them, of course, not spring chickens anymore. Both of them had already become famous writers and so on. And the play that was playing this year, actually, called either McCarthy versus Hellman or Hellman versus McCarthy, had to do with this incident from the 1980s. And perhaps someone in the audience has seen this play or heard about it, because it just was on this year. It featured Dick Cavett, the well-known TV personality from the 70s and 80s, who had a television show where he interviewed people. And It was actually in January of 1980, I believe, that he interviewed Mary McCarthy on his TV show, and in the course of talking about various authors that they knew and that he knew, Mary McCarthy knew, he mentioned Lillian Hellman, and Mary McCarthy famously said something like, well, she doesn't tell the truth, and every one of her sentences is a lie. Every word in it is a lie, including and the, which of course feature famously in everybody's writing and speaking, those two words, and the. But Mary McCarthy spoke, perhaps she was meaning to be kind of, joking, I don't know. But when Lillian Hellman heard about this and probably saw the television show, probably she had a friend who said, oh, you better turn on the show real quick because Dick Cavett is on and he is interviewing Mary McCarthy and she's saying bad things about you, whatever. Anyway, Lillian Hellman was not amused, and she brought a sizable legal suit against Mary McCarthy. She sued her for over $2 million for, libel and so on. And that suit went on for several years. I mean, it was, how long it takes to get things through the courts in any case. And it was still around 3 or 4 years later, and it had not yet been resolved when Lillian Hellman finally passed away herself. She died, and her lawyers withdrew the suit at that point. But it had been hanging like a millstone over Mary McCarthy for at least 4 years by then. And like I say, Lillian Hellman was not a bit amused by the remarks that Mary McCarthy made about her. Well, I want to say a little bit more about those two women and their lives, and especially now that they are back once again in the limelight, having been in this play this spring in 2014, which I don't know how many people actually, I tried to find a review of it, but I didn't. I found a lot of announcements that it was going to go on, but I don't think I ever saw a review on TV about that particular play and that occasion. But one of the interesting things about it is that apparently Dick Cavett played himself. He is still around. Mary McCarthy passed away a long time ago. And as I say, Lillian Hellman passed away a long time ago. But Dick Cavett is still around, and apparently he was in the play that was featured this year in New York City. Well, Lillian Hellman was, as I mentioned, born in New Orleans, and she actually spent a lot of her time traveling between New Orleans and New York City as a girl. New Orleans was really her native city, and she had relatives there, of course. But she had some difficulties, family difficulties, and aunts in New Orleans helped to raise her. And she later went to college for a short time, but she wound up in the 1930s in Hollywood, where she became a script reader. The movies are not always, but almost always, very, very closely scripted. It says exactly who's supposed to move when and where, and which camera is supposed to be picking up things from the script as the actors go through their lines and that sort of thing. So she became a script reader, Lillian Hellman did, in the 1930s. And when she was there, she met a well-known writer of mysteries whose name was Dashiell Hammett. And probably the film that he is best known for, that was made from one of his books, was the film that showed that big black bird. You know, it came out actually, I think, in about 1940, and it's often shown on Turner Classic Movies, shown once more on Turner Classic Movies. Dashiell Hammett wrote not only that book, but a number of other well-known mystery books, and he became acquainted with Lillian Hellman in the 1930s in Hollywood when they were both active there. And he encouraged her. In fact, he encouraged her to write The Children's Hour, which became a very popular play in 1934 in New York City. And they lived together off and on as lovers for a number of years. And she took care of him when he got sick in his old age. You know, he was somewhat older than she was. I think maybe as much as 12 or 15 years older than she was. And so she was around really to help nurse him through final illness and so forth. And she became the executor of his literary estate, Dashiell Hammett, and his detective stories are still popular today. I think it was Sam Spade was his well-known detective. Well, Lillian Hellman, like I say, wrote other plays that were quite popular, including The Little Foxes in the late 30s, which was about a Southern family and a particularly shrewish, well, I guess maybe not openly shrewish woman, but a young woman who was a great person in terms of doing in her relatives and making sure they didn't get along well with each other and so on, although she herself sort of pretended to be a lovely Southern lady. And she was played, actually, she was played in the movie by Bette Davis in the film The Little Foxes, made in the 1930s. And then, like I say, Lillian Hellman, early in the war, wrote the play Watch on the Rhine. Well, Watch on the Rhine is an interesting thing. I was familiar with the title, of course, and I had seen the film, which incidentally featured Bette Davis again in the leading role in Watch on the Rhine, which was, the book was written in 1940, and I'm not sure exactly when the film came out, but it was obviously greatly influenced by World War II and the problems, if you can call them problems, I mean the tragedies really associated with the Nazi and fascist era of the 1930s and 40s and World War II. And of course, the Nazis were famously anti-Semitic. Lillian Hellman was from a Jewish family herself, and so she particularly felt the problems that the Jews were having in Germany. When Hitler came to power in 1933, which was, about the same time that Franklin D. Roosevelt became president of the United States. Actually, he didn't become president until March because they still had the March 4th date for presidents taking office. But his birthday was in the toward the end of January. I think it was the 30th of January, and that was almost exactly the same time that Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. I don't think he was chancellor at first, but he was the head of the largest party that had been elected in 1932, the Nazi Party. And he took over in no time. I mean, you know, some people think that Hitler was not really much of a menace until 1938 or 1940. Well, of course, World War II began in Europe in September 1939, actually. But in the meantime, Hitler had famously brought Germany back to a much greater economic prosperity through such things as, you know, confiscating the wealth of the Jews, or forcing Jews essentially to leave Germany, and then later Austria, when he took over in Austria in 1938, because of the terrible laws against the Jews, who were not allowed to go to college even, and that was as early as 1933 when he came to power. And in the spring of 1933 even, the Nazis staged very notorious bonfires all around Germany, in which they burned up the books of classical Jewish authors, you know, not only Marx and Kant and so on, but other people, and they forbade the playing of the music. Well, not of Beethoven, obviously, who is not Jewish, but there was a popular German composer whose works were banned simply because he was of a Jewish background. Although he was raised a Christian, his father had converted to Christianity before he was even born. I'm speaking of Mendelssohn here, the German classical composer Mendelssohn, who lived in the early 19th century. But because he was of Jewish background, his works were banned from in Nazi Germany from classical music orchestras and so on. So, like I say, even in the spring of 1933, already just after Hitler had been in power for 4 months only, and he had dissolved all the parties except the Nazi Party by that time, by the spring of 1933. He was already very much acting against the Jews. And those bonfires took place of Jewish works. Well, anyway, that was part of the background of Helmand writing Watch on the Rhine. Now, in Germany, my husband and I have been to Germany. You know, my husband was a soldier in the U.S. Army and was stationed for a year in Germany in 1955, 1956, which was about 10 years after the end of World War II. We were already married at that time, but he was in Germany by himself, and I was teaching 7th grade at Fort Knox in Kentucky, where he had been stationed before being sent overseas. But in the summer of 1956, I took ship from Montreal and went up the St. Lawrence. You know, you're about halfway to Europe before you even get out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because you have to go so far north to get over to England and France and so on. And Spain is at about the same level as New York City, Spain in southern Europe. So Europe itself is so much farther north than we're used to thinking of here in North America. But in the summer of 1956, I joined my husband in Germany, and we went around to see all the various sites and go to museums and visit towns where famous Germans had lived. And one of the things that I remember from that trip was seeing a giant statue called the Watch on the Rhine. This giant statue, I think, was probably actually erected about the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, either just before that or following the Franco-Prussian War. But it was a huge statue of a sort of a woman-like person, the statue of a victory, I guess, or a female warrior type person anyway, you know, with having a shield beside her and so forth. With her watch on the Rhine, she was looking across the river at France, because France and Germany had been traditional enemies for quite some time. Actually, there was no real Germany until a consolidation which took place in 1870, led by the Prussian state of what is now the eastern part, was the eastern part of Germany. After the war, Prussia was dismantled totally. The people who lived there, the German-speaking people who lived in Prussia, had to leave, and the area was taken over partly by the Poles and partly by the Soviets and the East Germans. And Prussia, traditional Prussia, was gone. That was certainly not the case in the 19th century, when Bismarck, the great Prussian leader, led the effort to consolidate all the German states, of which there had been a number of small states and various sized states, including one along the Rhine River on the east bank of the Rhine River, which is where this famous statue is, called Watch on the Rhine, which looks from Germany over into France across the river as the traditional enemies between France and Germany. Now we have the European Union, and people are getting along, hopefully, a lot better than they did, and the Germans are actually the most prosperous of the European Union states. No question about it, in spite of the fact that the Germans lost the Second World War, and the Soviets took off with much of the machinery and so forth, took it back to the Soviet Union and so on. But after the war, West Germany was for a number of years, was under military control of England, Great Britain, that is, France, and the United States. And those three parts of West Germany, united, were greatly benefited by American aid during the 1950s and 60s, and Germany became a great economic power in the center of Europe, as it is today, actually. Well, Watch on the Rhine was this famous statue, and the whole idea of, being careful about the Rhine River, because at least during a part of the Rhine River, France is on one side and Germany is on the other. Later on, it runs through Germany on both sides of the river before coming out into the North Atlantic Ocean eventually, the Rhine River. And that would be why the statue was called Watch on the Rhine. When we were there in 1967, we were in southern Germany and the part that had been a part of the U.S. Territory during the occupation. We were near Freiburg, and we were near the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald. And at that point, across the Rhine is France. And I took my young son, who was at the time 5, namely David, who lives here in Athens now. And since we were there for the summer of 1967, we went on a bus ride into France, across the river. And one of the things that was every person on the bus was craning his neck to see out the window was French women still traditionally washing clothes in a river on the other side of the Rhine, a little creek sort of thing that I imagine eventually ran into the Rhine. But everyone said, imagine that, they're still washing their clothes in the river, which perhaps we associate more likely with other parts of less developed world than France. But that's just a sidelight, certainly, from 1967 and the summer that we spent near the Black Forest and the city of Freiburg. Well, this is one reason I'm going on and on about memories, probably, is that this day, June 20th, is actually my birthday. This is my 82nd birthday since I was born on June 20th, 1932. And I was struck by the fact that when I looked in Kirsten Olson's book, Remember the Ladies, that I discovered that the famous woman born on June 20th was Lillian Hellman. So this is one of the reasons why, since it's my birthday, I'm, as well as hers, that I am featuring her in our talk today about women of yesterday. She did die. She passed away in 1985 when she was not quite 80 years old herself. So she's been gone for a long time, but as I say, she was quite a well-known author of plays during the 1930s and 1940s. And she's also remembered for her appearance before the House Un-American Activities Committee. I think it was in 1952, if I'm not mistaken. The House Un-American Activities Committee got started before the Second World War, and they were mostly, I think, 1939 or 40, they were sort of concentrating on people who were friendly to the Nazis and fascists, the Italian fascists, to Mussolini and Hitler and the like. But after the Second World War, the House Un-American Activities Committee of the United States House of Representatives turns its attention primarily to communist influence or alleged communist influence in the United States. And they got going in 1946 on that, and 1947. And probably their best known member of the House Un-American Activities Committee was a man who later became President of the United States. I refer to Richard Nixon. Nixon, who was a World War II veteran, had been elected to the House, I believe, in 1945. He was a new member in Congress just after World War II, and made his name, made his mark, really, and his fame through his participation in the House Un-American Activities Committee, which called a number of communists, former communists, fellow travelers fellow traveler was a term that you used to hear. I don't think people use it anymore, but fellow travelers were supposedly those folks who went along with the communists, who favored the communists during the 30s, who favored the Soviet Union and spoke up for the Soviet Union. One of whom, I should add, certainly was Lillian Hellman, and her lover, Dashiell Hammett, had definitely been a member of the Communist Party during the 1930s, as had a number of people who thought that maybe the future lay with the Soviet Union. That was a time that is hard to recall, really. The 1930s, when Italy was under the control of the fascist party led by Benito Mussolini, and Germany after 1933 was under the control of Adolf Hitler. The leader, Führer, simply means leader. He was called Führer, der Führer, which simply meant leader. Mussolini was called Duce, which also means leader. Il Duce was Mussolini. And the Soviet Union was also definitely under the control of a dictator. He didn't take that name. Actually, his official title was something like Secretary of the Communist Party, but in effect he was the de facto dictator of the Soviet Union, especially after 1937, when he instituted a notorious group of trials in which a number of the old Bolsheviks, he himself was a Bolshevik because the Bolsheviks were the party that had eventually triumphed in the Soviet Union after 1923, and Lenin and Stalin was the man who succeeded Lenin as the top leader in the Soviet Union. Lenin wasn't destined to be leader for very long because he died in 1924, and after that there was a struggle for power between Trotsky, who was a Bolshevik leader, and Stalin. Stalin, incidentally, like Hitler, had a nom de guerre. I think they say that Stalin means steel, so he was considered to be the man of steel in the Soviet Union, but his real name was something that I'm not sure I could pronounce correctly, a very Slavic kind of name, you know, with about 8 syllables and so forth. But he was the one who succeeded in the struggle against Trotsky after the death of Lenin, and Trotsky went into exile and then was pursued by Soviet agents who finally managed to assassinate him in Mexico, and I believe it was 1939. But one of the interesting things in terms of our two women that we're talking about, Lillian Hellman and Mary McCarthy, is that Mary McCarthy was considered to be a Trotsky sympathizer in the 1930s when Trotsky was still around. She apparently had been somewhat of a sympathizer with Trotsky. And Lillian Hellman was a Stalinist practically to the end of Stalin's days, in spite of the terrible things that he did in the trials in 1937 and so on. Lillian Hellman stuck by Stalin almost to the very end, and actually his very end was in 1954. Stalin died in 1954, and that's another interesting memory from my past, interesting to me at any rate. That was the year that I was teaching on the Indian reservation in northern Nevada. I was teaching mostly Shoshone, Western Shoshone Indians on that reservation. Part of it was in Nevada and part of it was actually in Idaho because it straddled the border between those two states. I taught 5th grade there in the year 1953-54 and 1952-53, and that was an interesting time. It was my first year teaching. I had known Indians growing up in Nevada over my lifetime. When I was a tiny baby, I had an Indian nursemaid down in southern Nevada in Pahrump, and I'm still in touch. I think I've mentioned before, I'm still in touch with Clarabelle Jim, who was in my mother's she was teaching a one-room schoolhouse, and Clarabelle Jim was in 2nd grade when she had my mother as her teacher in 1934. Clarabelle is still around, and we exchange Christmas cards and news at Christmas time. She's still living in Las Vegas, not too far from Pahrump. Well, anyway, I was teaching in northern Nevada in 1952-53, the Western Shoshone Reservation. And it was pretty far away from places. Well, we were about 40 miles south of a city in Utah, in Idaho, but we were 100 miles north of Elko, and Elko was the nearest big town to the reservation where I was living at that time. And we always went south to Elko rather than north because the schools were under the control of the state of Nevada, and so the teachers had natural connections with the schools and the teachers who were other people living in Elko County, Nevada at that time. Well, anyway, it was in the spring, I think it must have been in March of 1953, and it had been a very quiet weekend. I had listened to the opera, I think, on the radio on Saturday afternoon, and after that I just turned off the radio. I didn't have any plans to, go out to supper or anything like that with those of the other teachers who lived there. And so it was just a quiet time. I guess I did a lot of reading and so forth that weekend. And when I finally turned on the radio, which I think was probably on Monday, I discovered that the world had changed because Joseph Stalin, the famous dictator of the Soviet Union, had died. And so, of course, that was the only thing that was on the radio at the time. And he had died the previous day, and I hadn't even realized that the world had changed because I was so far away up there on the Indian reservation in northern Nevada. And of course, there was no newspaper there, and since I hadn't even turned on the radio, I hadn't even been aware that Stalin had expired. Well, anyway, as I say, Hellman was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952. And by 1952, Richard Nixon had not only gone on from being a member of the House of Representatives, but in 1950 he had been elected to the U.S. Senate from California, from his home state. And in 1952, he would become the candidate for vice president running with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And as you know, he was elected in the fall of 1952 with Eisenhower on the ticket. and served as vice president for 8 years, was defeated very, very narrowly by President Kennedy in 1960, but then came back in 1968 and was elected president. Anyway, in 1952, Lillian Hellman appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and she took a different tack. There were some people who had been accused of being communists, and many of whom had been communists, or at least fellow travelers going along with the Soviet line often. But she had taken a different stand. She said that she would say anything, they could ask her any questions they wanted to about herself and her activities. She denied having been a member of the Communist Party. It's a little unclear whether she ever was. If she was, it was in the late 1930s for a while, or she at least, it was well known she'd attended some meetings then. But she said she would not, she felt that she could not testify about anyone else. And she got away with that. She was one of the few people who actually got away with telling the House Un-American Activities Committee that she would not testify. She would not testify except about herself and her own activities. And she's considered quite a heroine by people who thought that the House Un-American Activities Committee had gone too far in pursuing communists and alleged communists. I myself remember well that in the spring of 1954, by then I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and the House Un-American Activities Committee had sort of been overtaken by a senator, Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin, Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, who famously said in the spring of 1950 that he had in his pocket the name of 100 communists who were members of the State Department, the U.S. State Department. He made that allegation in Wheeling, West Virginia, not very far from here, as a matter of fact, in 1950. And for a long time, he was very popular, especially on the right. People on the right believed in him, but he finally went a little too far. I remember reading the headlines on the spring of 1954. You know, McCarthy says Army is full of communists, or it was words to that effect. And I said, my goodness. Of course, by then, Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States, and he had famously been the great general who led the Allied forces on D-Day in 1944, on June 6, 1944. But he became president of the United States and started serving in 1953. And so he was a famous Army general who became president. And when I read this headline that McCarthy had accused the Army of being full of communists or something, I thought, gosh, you know, either he's going to be dictator in this country or he's going to be out. Well, it turned out that he was out because he had gone too far in making these charges against the American military. But anyway, that was a few of those ancient memories that I recall from the early 50s. And as I pointed out, Hellman and McCarthy, Mary McCarthy, not at all related to Joseph McCarthy, but another Irish person by background who came from the state of Washington originally, had this set to in the year 1980, and for 3 or 4 years until Lillian Hellman's death. Now, one of the things that Lillian Hellman was accused of lying about was a trip that she supposedly made, and she talked about it in one of her autobiographies called Pentimento, that she had made a trip to Germany and had smuggled in money to help the people who were underground, who were trying to oppose Hitler and the Hitler regime. And that part of her memoir was made into a famous movie called Julia, which was came out, I think, in 1976. And in that movie, Lillian Hellman was played by Jane Fonda, and the Julia, the woman in Germany who was a member of the people who were opposing Hitler, was played by Vanessa Redgrave. And that was quite a famous film in 1976, and I believe got Academy Awards and so on. But Mary McCarthy discovered that there was a very strange parallel between this story about Julia and the actual life of a woman whose name was not Julia at all, and who had survived in the film and in the story as written by Lillian Hellman. This woman who was in the underground opposing Hitler in the 1930s died, and so did her child. But it turned out that this very similar story of a woman who had been a student in Vienna, this was part of Julia's story, supposedly, was that she had been a medical student in Vienna, that she had been crippled and had been trapped, in a sense, in Austria and later in Germany, and that this whole story was really the life story of a woman who actually survived and was still alive in the 1980s. And so it came out, and people said, well, this is really, really strange. I mean, these stories are so similar except for the endings. And yet Lillian Hellman claimed that she knew this woman, that she had smuggled money into her to oppose the Nazis and so on. And so, you know, what is this? Well, some people said it was apocryphal stories, apocryphiers, that these people were apocryphiers. They were telling lies just to sensationalize the story. Well, and that could be, because after all, well-known authors have been known to do such things in the past, even if they've had very interesting lives themselves. Sometimes they've spiced it up a bit with a little bit of fiction and so on. And one of the people who spoke about Lillian Hellman and her apocryphal, sometimes apocryphal writings, was this woman, whom I'm also going to mention because she was a contemporary. She was born in 1908 in St. Louis, and her name was Martha Gellhorn. This is the biography of her that was written in the early 1990s, shortly after the deaths of both Lillian Hellman in 1985 and Mary McCarthy in 1989, I guess maybe it was. But Martha Gellhorn had met Lillian Hellman when she was in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Martha Gellhorn was a popular writer. She came from a substantial St. Louis family. Her mother was a well-known member of the League of Women Voters who had worked for women's suffrage before women's suffrage passed in 1920. There's a picture in here showing Martha Gellhorn as a little girl of about 12 or well, no, she was, maybe it was in 1912 or 1913. Anyway, she was a little girl with her mother in a parade of women who were out to get the vote. And her mother, Edna Gellhorn, knew President Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And actually, Martha Gellhorn had stayed at the White House in the 1930s, visited there, had been there to lunch to see Eleanor Roosevelt and so on. And Martha Gellhorn was in Spain in 1937, early 1937, when the Spanish Civil War was on, and the frequently German planes flew over Madrid bombing. Some were German planes that were piloted by Spanish pilots. Others apparently were German planes piloted by Germans themselves, because the Nazis were helping. The Nazis and the fascists both were helping the forces under General Franco that opposed the Spanish Republic. Martha Gellhorn was there with a man that she had just met in December of 1936, who was a very popular author, very popular American author, who is still, I think, widely read, and that was Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway had had 2 wives and had some boys, I believe. Don't think he ever had any daughters, but he had several boys by his first 2 marriages, and eventually in the late 30s, after he and Martha Gellhorn had gone to Spain more or less together in 1937, he married her, and she became the 3rd Mrs. Ernest Hemingway. That marriage lasted about 5 years, and she was the only one of the wives who actually left him. His other earlier wives had been divorced by, well, Ernest Hemingway divorced her too, but she walked out first. So anyway, she was a popular author. She wrote often in the magazine called Collier's, and she was a war correspondent. She went to Finland in 1940 when the Soviets invaded Finland. She reported from Finland. She went to China in 1940-41 with Hemingway at that time. They were both reporting on the war in China, between China and Japan at that time. And later during World War II, she served as a foreign correspondent in Europe, mostly in Europe, and at a time when she and Hemingway were actually breaking up in the late 1944-45 time frame. He was already seeing a woman who became his 4th wife, and who was still his wife at the time of his suicide in the 1950s, Ernest Hemingway. Martha Gellhorn always lived sort of in his shadow. People remembered that she had been the wife of a famous American author, and they didn't remember so much that she herself had been a foreign correspondent, had written a number of books, travel books. She had lived all over the world. She lived for several years in Africa in the 1950s, late 1950s, 60s. She was a foreign correspondent in Vietnam during the American war in Vietnam, which she opposed very strongly, actually. But toward the end of her life, especially after her mother's death in 1970, she lived almost exclusively in England. And this man, Carl Rollison, who wrote this book, Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave, The Adventurous Life of America's Most Glamorous and Courageous War Correspondent. Like her mother, she had beautiful blonde hair, and her mother had beautiful blonde braids, very, very thick braids to the very end of her life, which she wore sort of like I wear mine, only of course mine's very thin now and has never been blonde. But she wore, Edna Gellhorn, Martha's mother, wore her hair in this beautiful thick braid coronet that she had. It's like I say, she and her mother, her mother's name had been Martha, and she married her. She named her only daughter for her grandmother Martha as well. So here's another famous woman from these same times, Martha Gellhorn, who reported from the Spanish Civil War, from the Finnish War, from World War II, where she became a friend of General James Gavin. Ever hear that name? There's a power plant down on the Ohio River, not very far from here, named the Gavin Plant, which was named for the young general who headed the 82nd Airborne Forces in World War II, and who met Martha Gellhorn when she was a war correspondent, and they were friends for quite a long time. So there's a natural connection just a few miles away from us to Martha Gellhorn. And Carl Rollison told how he had tracked down her house in Wales, which was in a strange little town far away from every place, and no one was home, so he surreptitiously took pictures of the house. Gellhorn would never speak to him because she didn't want anyone writing her biography, and she refused to write an autobiography herself. She somewhat famously said, you know, autobiographies are not that truthful. Well, we don't know. Mostly what we know about people is what they have said about themselves and their own lives, and that's what I've been talking about today, and this being my birthday, here's my beautiful bowl with the old English roses, and here's my famous necklace with all the charms that I've collected since 1967. Since today is my 82nd birthday, June 20th, the birthday of Lillian Hellman, and June 21st, tomorrow, the birthday of Mary McCarthy, two women recently on the stage in New York City about the tremendous battle and fight that they had in the 1980s. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.